This video continues covering chapter 8.4 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. More precisely, in this video we will show how to implement closed projection. Projections were already mentioned as an introduction to this chapter as a way to retrieve only some of the properties of our entity by creating interface and then defining getters only for the properties we are interested, and then to use this interface as a return value from our finder method. That way our finder method will be used to generate SQL statement which only retrieves specified properties instead of all of the properties of the entity. This can reduce time needed to fetch data if entity has a lot of columns and we are only interested in only some of them. So in this example, we will have our person entity with following properties, and we will have this custom constructor which will allow us to more easily insert person entities into database inside the load persons Java by using this code. This load persons Java implements command runner that will be executed when we start application, and it will insert these two entities into the database so that we have some data to work with. Now our person entity has following three properties, but by using person projection interface we will tell Hibernate that we are only interested in retrieving these two properties by specifying these two getters and then using this interface as a return value from our finder method. Then inside the controller we will create a single endpoint which will use finder method from the repository to fetch person entity with name Bill, and instead of actually fetching the entity we are actually fetching a person projection that will have these two getters. Spring Framework will use this interface to create a class that implements this interface, and this class will then have these two properties and these two getters which will allow us to access those properties. So when inside our endpoint our finder method returns an instance of a class that implements our person projection interface, we can then use this instance to and these getters to get the name and age that have been returned from the entity with this name. So now we can access have the name and age, and here inside the console we are displaying a message that is using this name and age properties, and our endpoint at the end returns person projection which will display this person projection in a JSON format. We can test our application by using Google Chrome web browser and entering URL of our endpoint, and endpoint will return person projection instance of a person projection interface with this name and age. And inside the console we can see that the SQL statement that has been generated by this finder method only retrieves name and age of person entity In other words, it retrieves only properties specified by our projection interface, name and age, and does not fetch additional properties like ID of the person. And we also see that inside the console, following string has been displayed, which was generated by these lines that read the name and age properties from a instance of a person projection interface. So we have now shown with this tutorial how we can use person projection interface, in this case a closed projection, which simply returns a subset of properties, to tell Finder methods that it should create SQL statement that only fetches subset of entity properties from the database instead of all of the properties. This can reduce the time needed to fetch the data from the database in case our property has a lot more properties that we are not interested in.